Today's headline is Boundaries of Indiana. The subheadline says, Precise statement of their origin and controversies about them. It says, the recent conference between the governors of Indiana and Kentucky in regard to the jurisdiction over Green Island awakens interest in the subject of the state's boundaries. Indiana has been more fortunate than many other states in the matter of her boundary disputes, which have been few and not violent. Our limits are known and definite, yet how many know what they are? The region of Indiana, along with the rest of the Ohio and Great Lakes Territory, was in the hands of the French until the middle of the last century, when it passed over to the British. They held it until the close of the Revolutionary War. The Treaty of Peace with Great Britain in 1783 fixed the Mississippi River as the western boundary of the United States. The title to Indiana thenceforth rested in some power within the United States, but with whom? Every inch of the country west of the Alleghenies was claimed by some one or more of the original 13 states. Indiana was claimed in part or in whole by New York, Connecticut, and Virginia. The different claimants being unable to agree, the matter was settled by the cession of the claims of each to the United States. Virginia, however, refused to give up Kentucky, and that is a fact of importance to Indiana. For Virginia made over to the United States the territory or tract of country within the limits of the Virginia Charter, situate, lying, and being to the northwest of the River Ohio. That has been interpreted to mean that Kentucky comes up to the lower water mark on the north side of the river. The next step was when in 1787, Congress organized the government of the territory northwest of the River Ohio. It provided for the formation within this territory of not less than 3, nor more than 5 states. The western state was to be bounded by the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers, the Wabash as far as the Vincennes, a line due north from Vincennes to the Canadian boundary, and that boundary, the middle state by the Wabash and the Vincennes line, by the Ohio, by a due north line from the mouth of the Great Miami, and by the Canadian line. The eastern state by the Miami line, the Ohio, Pennsylvania, and the Canadian line. Provided, however, that the boundaries of these free states shall be subject to be so altered that if Congress shall hereafter find it expedient, they shall have authority to form 1 or 2 states in that part of the said territory which lies north of an east and west line drawn for the southerly bend or extreme of Lake Michigan. Congress chose to make 5 states, but did not choose in any case to follow this east and west line, although the ordinance of 1787 was in the nature of a compact. The present boundaries of Indiana, as described in the act enabling it to become a state, are these. Bounded on the east by the Meridian line, which forms the western boundary of the state of Ohio. On the south by the River Ohio, from the mouth of the Great Miami River to the mouth of the River Wabash. On the west by a line drawn along the middle of the Wabash, from its mouth to a point where a due north line, drawn from the town of Vincennes, would last touch the northwestern shore of said river, and from thence by a due north line until the same shall intersect the east and west line, drawn through a point 10 miles north of the southern extreme of Lake Michigan. On the north, by the said east and west line, until the same shall intersect the first mentioned meridian line, which forms the western boundary of the state of Ohio. The western boundary of Ohio is the meridian that passes through the mouth of the Great Miami River. The bounds of Indiana are thus definitely stated, and the only trouble is in interpreting the expressions used. The southern boundary question very soon came up in a case considered by the United States Supreme Court in 1820, Chief Justice Marshall rendering the decision. The United States, by virtue of the Virginia Deed of Cession, had given title to a certain piece of land on the north bank of the Ohio, which was an island during high water and a peninsula during low water. But Kentucky had granted the same land to a different person. The question then was whether the land was in Indiana or Kentucky. Chief Justice Marshall decided that it belonged to Indiana on the principle of international law, that when one state owns on both sides of a river and grants title on one side of it to another state, it grants only to the river's edge and not to the middle. Then the question is, what is the river? Marshall said, whenever the river is a boundary between states, it's the main, the permanent river, which constitutes that boundary, and the mind will find itself embarrassed with insurmountable difficulty in attempting to draw any other line than the low water mark. The direct decision was only that Kentucky extends no further north than to the low water mark on the north shore, but the argument clearly implies that Indiana extends no further than to the same mark. The northern boundary of Indiana has never been seriously questioned, although Michigan and Wisconsin have always insisted that they were defrauded when Congress departed from the line originally laid down in the Ordinance of 1787, an east and west line for the southern extreme of Lake Michigan. But in the case of Indiana, as well as of Illinois, Congress had distinctly stated what the bound should be, and there was no remedy. In Ohio, the convention that framed the first Constitution had provided that the northern boundary should be on a line from the southern end of Lake Michigan to the most northerly cape of Miami Bay, Lake Erie. This is not an east and west line, but runs northeast so as to include Toledo and Ohio. In admitting Ohio, Congress neither rejected nor approved this line, which of course amounted to accepting it. This left such a loophole that when Michigan came to be admitted some 30 years later, a very violent dispute arose. Troops were called out in both states, and war was narrowly averted. Michigan was finally pacified by being given the northern peninsula, originally intended for Wisconsin. So Wisconsin asserts that she was swindled on all sides. Indiana was left out of the conflict because there were then in the 10-mile strip no considerable towns that Michigan coveted. Indiana's boundaries ought to be definite enough. The occasional discussions as to the eastern and western lines can involve nothing more than the accuracy of the surveys that establish the lines laid down in the Enabling Act. This article was written by William F. Harding. This story came from the great state of Indiana, being reported in the Indianapolis News of October 26, 1895. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.